Stay tuned to find out which headless, toothless, eyeless animal Cleopatra once named as sacred. Stick around to discover why beavers, otherwise known as ecosystem engineers, are one of the best neighbours 1 in 6 UK properties could ever hope for in the face of climate change. And join me to find out why, despite the predicted rise from 7 to 10 billion people by 2050, we don't necessarily need more land to produce more food. Hello my friend, I'm Rebecca, and it's so good to have, it's so good to be back. It's so good to have you here, but it's also so good to be back because there was a massive break between the last episode and this one. It was a much needed bit of downtime for me, not just from filming, producing and creating, but in terms of just some self-healing and a journey that I needed to go on and had been due to go on for a long time. So even though it was wonderful to take that time out, it's so good to be back. So coming up next, I'm gonna get comfy and get my tea ready, as we're gonna jump in together into the 3 biggest takeaways from this incredible book, what it inspired me to do next, and why it deserves its rightful place on the bookshelf behind me for 101 books to save the planet and ourselves. But before we jump in, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button. It helps more than you know. The first key takeaway from the book Wilding was that some of the biggest concerns and challenges of our time, climate change, pollution, human health, conservation, biodiversity collapse, water control, all boil down to our soils. That brown thing that we pay very little attention to, that sits underneath our feet, and that inside soil live earthworms, who are not just incredible ecosystem engineers, they are described as the intestines of the earth. And Cleopatra knew this. Cleopatra was no dummy. She described earthworms as sacred. And it wasn't even just Cleopatra that recognised earthworms' importance and the fact that they were these intestines of the earth. It was Charles Darwin who spent 39 years researching earthworms. We pay little attention to earthworms, if any at all, yet they have been ranked number 1 most influential species in the history of the planet. Number 1! And that's above dinosaurs and humans. Earthworms are farmers and gardeners' best friends, yet they're ignored or worked against. We don't work with them in most senses. We've been disregarding, in effect, 600 million years of knowledge from these incredible earthworms that, really simply put, know best. And therefore we've got to pay better attention to earthworms and work with them, not against them. And on page 277, Isabella says, "But it's only in the last couple of decades that earthworm scientists, yes, that is a job, has begun to understand more about the biology of earthworms and the miracles they can perform." So you might be thinking, cool, well, Cleopatra had a thing for earthworms, clearly, and so did Charles Darwin. But what the hell did earthworms ever do for me? Quite simply, healthy earthworms equals, that's an equal sign, healthy soils. And they are really interconnected. We've been ignoring that for too long. Earthworms are a keystone species. And what that means is they have huge impact on their ecosystems. They can influence the physical, biological, chemical makeup of the soils. They break down organic matter and fertilise the soil. They make soil healthy. Earthworms can actually repair and almost recover damaged and unhealthy soils, and this makes them incredibly exciting for us to work with rather than work against. And there's even been studies that have suggested that earthworms can help clean up contaminated land. If you're still really not convinced that we're completely interconnected to not only the soils but obviously the earthworms that are the ecosystem engineers of the soils, have a think about this. Think about maybe your favourite meal or perhaps a really delicious snack you enjoy during the week or weekend. Those things are absolutely intrinsically connected because there is no food security without healthy soils. And the soils depend on these incredible engineers, earthworms. That was the first biggest key takeaway from this beautiful book, Wilding, in the chapter Rewilding Our Soils. The second key takeaway from this book, Wilding, was that beavers actually help lock up carbon if they're present in ecosystems, which is pretty useful considering we're in a climate change crisis. Not only do they lock up carbon, but they halt. Yes, they literally halt flooding. And that's pretty important in this backdrop that I'm going to set the scene of now. On average, flooding actually costs the UK 1.1 billion per year. 1 in 6 UK properties are now at risk of flooding. That's huge, 1 in 6. And hence why I mentioned at the beginning that 1 in 6 UK properties' best neighbour they could ever hope for would be a beaver to help protect them from that. In fact, you are statistically more likely now in the UK to be flooded than you are burgled. Rather than governments and councils investing in short-term fixes that work against nature, we need to be thinking about rewilding the rivers far more and working with things like beavers, like keystone ecosystem engineers, keystone species that actually will not only help lock up carbon, but breathe life back into the land, but also halt flooding, considering that 1 in 6 UK properties are now at risk. And that's only going to increase with climate change and intensities of extreme weather only getting worse. Now, you may be thinking, well, beavers, did we ever have beavers in the UK? Yes, we did. Beavers were once part of the British landscape. Beavers were once native and abundant to the UK, before us bloodthirsty humans hunted them all to extinction. As Isabella writes here on page 239, she says, during storm events, surface water leaving the beaver-modified site contains 3 times less sediment than the water entering it. A 3-hectare area fed by a tiny headwater stream that once would have held just about a few hundred litres of water pre-beaver now holds 1 million litres. So on the graph, the water volumes leaving a particular site, which were once roller coasters of extreme flooding and drought, now much more gentle line on the graph. And this is what makes beavers incredibly exciting. They are engineers that were once native and abundant within the UK, and we're missing this keystone species within our landscapes. So next to this incredible role that beavers play in the ecosystem in terms of helping to act like a sponge, holding that storm water and huge amounts of water coming through from flooding and then release it slowly. Not only do they do that, but beavers are an incredibly important part of the puzzle that we need to figure out in this ability to help lock up carbon quickly within this climate crisis. And on page 240, in the chapter I should say, Bringing Back the Beaver, Isabella says this, which was super interesting. She said, studies have focused on the carbon sequestration of beaver dams. So that means there have been studies that have focused on how beaver dams can lock up and draw down carbon. The process of locking up carbon in the sediment of beaver ponds, geoscientists claim, could have a significant mitigating effect on climate change. Beavers not only halt flooding, which we now really need to think about, seeing as you're much more likely to be flooded in the UK than you are burgled. And not only do they do that, but they are incredible habitat creators. I mean, this particular stream had 75 times more water birds because a beaver was present, right through to them being a solution, a part of the solution in the climate crisis, because they can mitigate and lock up huge amounts of carbon, and geoscientists have been talking about this. So in this chapter, Bringing Back the Beaver, that was the second biggest takeaway. It's the importance of beavers in our landscape. At Knepp Estate in Sussex, where this book and the story is set, They actually do have beavers there, and I was lucky enough to go and visit the site. And the ecologist Penny there invited me to go in to see the beavers. When I stepped into the beaver pen, which is a huge space, it was like walking into paradise. It's like something out of the film Maleficent, and it was just stunning. You heard this trickle of the water and this abundance of green. The water was just being held by the land and these incredible dams they had created. The third and final key takeaway from this book, listening close because this is pretty important and it's not common knowledge. The world is currently producing enough food to feed more people than are alive today. So ploughing up more rainforests and ploughing more fields and cutting more trees to make way for crops and animals to feed our bellies is so crazy it makes my head hurt. With global population predicted to rise from 8 to 10 billion people by 2050, the message being driven by the powerful food producers and retailers and farmers' unions is the need to increase food production. We need more food for more people. It's a very strong fallback argument that prevents farmland or land of any kind being given back to nature. So what is the gap anyway? What's the gap between why are there people still going hungry and we're already producing enough food for another 2-3 billion people that are not even on this planet yet? Well, there are different reasons, and Isabella explains that in the book, but one of the biggest can sit and be summarised in just 2 words: food waste. 1/3 of food waste globally goes to waste, and that ends up in what we call landfill. So that's about 33% of all food produced ends up in landfill. And it's in the chapter Creating a Mess that this third and final key takeaway came from. And on page 134, Isabella goes into a little bit more detail about how this food waste is even happening. And in developing countries, food tends to be lost at the front of the food chain, she shares. For example, she gives a specific mention here which just blew my mind. India loses an estimated 40% of its fruit and vegetables before they even reach the markets. And it really struck me actually in this book to be reminded by Isabella that between 1940 and 1954, wasting food was a criminal offence. Yet today, the UK throws away 9.5 million tonnes of food per year. That's emitting 25 million tonnes of carbon, which is more than Kenya's total annual emissions. By 2030, Rewilding Europe estimates that there will be 30 million hectares of abandoned farmland in Europe. What happens to this land is an issue concerning governments, including the UK. The reality? This abandoned land is an opportunity for nature to heal itself, as a solution to climate change, to bring back some wild and to create cleaner, greener and a much fairer world. Towards the end of every episode, I always answer the question, what did this book that I read inspire me to do next? Well, actually it was 2 things that the book inspired me to do next. And the first was to pay far more attention to the bird, the jay. Now, you're probably familiar with this bird. We have it here in the UK, which is great, but the jay is actually an incredible bird with an absolutely fascinating partnership, which most people don't know about, with the oak tree. Now, what do jays do? Well, they plant acorns, and other species do this as well, but not with the precision and skill as the jay. And this makes them the single most important woodland regeneration agent in the woodland. And that just blew my mind. And most people don't know this, that jays can actually carry up to 6 acorns at once and can plant up to 7,500 acorns in just 4 weeks. And the second thing it inspired me to do is to actually go and visit Knepp Estate, where this book is based. And anybody can go and do that. You just need to look online at Knepp estate, that's Knepp, in Sussex. And you can either book to go camping there, you can go and do a safari tour like I did, and learn more about what they're doing and see the incredible white storks that now call the Knepp estate home. My favourite moment from this wonderful book, Wilding, was actually at the very beginning, and it was the timeline at the very beginning of the book, which is all set on the Knepp estate, and it actually begins in the 12th century, where she refers to the Knepp castle, and takes us all the way through to 2019. And when I read this timeline, I was sat in a cafe, and I remember actually welling up, because I just found it so incredibly beautiful and emotional to hear the differences between how the land had been used, species had been hunted, the land use had changed again, it had become an intensive farm by the time Charlie and Isabella owned it, to the point where they started then reintroducing the plants and the animals. So I'd like to finish up the episode with the simple question, why does the book that I've been talking about for the last hour or so, why does it deserve its place on the bookshelf of, behind me, of 101 books to save the planet and ourselves? Well, I can safely say with absolute conviction in my heart that this book deserves its place rightfully on that bookshelf. And it does, because rewilding or wilding of the land is such a crucial ally that we have in the fight of climate change, but also in the view of biodiversity collapse and loss of species. Rewilding and wilding of the land, which this book is all about, is based on that ally that we really need to pay attention to. This book is a really compelling story of what rewilding is, but also what rewilding isn't, and the magic and wonder that can really happen when we simply step back, put nature in the driving seat, and allow nature to heal and to rebalance itself simply by giving it a helping hand. And the story of this British farm that Charlie and Isabella own, and the blueprint they've shown in which they can actually change a piece of land that was once a carbon emitter to a carbon sink, which means it now actually holds more carbon than it once emitted. It's an incredible story of hope and transformation that we really do need in the world that we now find ourselves in, and with the challenges we now face. I hope you can join me for this next episode, to join me for this first ever book on climate change and its impacts, in which it actually made me laugh. A hilarious and really thought-provoking book in which the author Sophie travels the length of Britain on foot, bicycle, boat, electric car, kayak, you name it, she does it. The book is called Forget Me Not by Sophie Pavell, Finding the Forgotten Species of Climate Change. You're not going to want to miss this.